Hello, and welcome to this web presentation on how to effortlessly write the perfect short story in 1 hour. My name is Andy Heath, and I'm going to be guiding you through this presentation. I hope you enjoy it. I'm very passionate about writing. I want to teach people how to do it. I've done a lot of it, and I think I've got a lot to offer people in terms of good practices, good processes. I've heard a lot of people say that they have problems developing their ideas, problems coming up with ideas, problems getting those stories from their head onto the page. And the purpose of this presentation is to work on that and show you some practices and processes that you can use to come up with ideas and develop those ideas into something that is actually something you can be proud of, something that's more than just a short story or something like a novel swirling around in your head, but actually something really that people can read on paper. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about myself and why I came up with this particular presentation and why I feel like I'm qualified to tell you how to do it, how to write short stories. I'm the author of 2 novels. I've written dozens of short stories, and I've written a lot of things, hundreds of blog posts. I've been journaling for about 10 years, so I've written several thousand journal entries. I've written tens of thousands of emails and other correspondence, and I've actually published a number of short stories, and I've got 1 novel available on Amazon Kindle. I really enjoy reading, and I enjoy writing, and I want to share that with you. I know a lot of people are of the opinion that there's too much literature out there. My opinion is that there's not enough good literature out there, and that people like you are actually capable of creating that good literature and may not have the processes in place to do it just yet. So what I want to do is show you exactly how to do that. So I'm going to go to the next slide and talk about what the purpose of this video is. And basically what I hope to accomplish is I want to show you why you need to plan a short story before you write it. And a lot of this video is going to be teaching you how to plan the short story in addition to how to write it. And I'm also going to teach you how to generate a lot of short story ideas on your own. I know a lot of people have problems developing and coming up with their own short stories, ideas. So I'm going to show you how to do that. And I'm also going to show you how to turn those ideas in your head into real short stories on paper. So I've done a lot of training in my life. I've done a lot of training in my career, and every time I do a training, I always like to start with an agenda and tell you exactly what we're going to cover. So I'm going to start with the next slide with this video agenda. In this training, I'm going to do quite a few things, so we're going to go as quickly as we can right into it, but I'm going to describe the 3 kinds of people that need to take this video course, and I'm also going to tell you what's not included in this course. So it's kind of like a scope of work. I want you to understand what you're going to be taking away from this course and what you're not. And in that regard, I'm going to be covering the course goals. There are a couple of things that I want you to specifically take away from this course. And once we go over that, we're going to go into part 1 of this course. There are 2 parts to this course, and the first part is a theory part. The theory part is very important, and I'll explain why. We're going to talk about the nature of an appropriate short story idea versus an inappropriate short story idea, which is better, which is worse, what the advantages and disadvantages are. We're going to talk about the role of inspiration in writing and I've got some very strong opinions about that. They may differ from a lot of my colleagues, but I want to share that with you in hopes that you can take some of that away from this presentation. And I'm also going to talk about something which is a little more mundane, but it's what I call the 3 essential aspects of any short story. You'll find these 3 essential aspects probably in any creative writing class, and that may be the only part of this presentation that you could actually hear somewhere else. The majority of this material is my own meandering experience in spending a lot of time in front of the page, either reading or writing. So, but I wouldn't be doing you any justice if I didn't go over the 3 essential aspects of any short story. Short stories, like anything else, have rules. We're going to go to the next slide and we're going to finish out the video agenda, which is part 2 of this course, and that's the practical application We're going to talk about what an idea is exactly and how to generate ideas, how to generate the beginning of an idea. And I'm going to explain to you that ideas do have beginnings and that there are stages they go through and that there's an idea process. So we're going to go over the 4 stages of the idea process. I'm also going to tell you how to move an idea through each stage of that idea process. That's very important when it comes to writing short stories. You actually have to be able to move the idea through that process. And finally, once you have actually processed the idea and moved it through to its completion, I'm going to talk about how to write a short story. And there are 5 essential elements to a short story from what I gather over my experience. And I'm going to go over those with you in depth. One thing that you don't see on here is that I'm actually going to do a practical exercise with you and show you how I used this idea process to design my own short story, which I'll tell you where you can read it later. But I want to show you that I practice what I preach, that this is a process that I actually use. And so it's not something that I just created to waste your time. It's a process that I've used. It's a process that works. I average a short story every week. So I've been doing that for a while. This process works to actually create quite a bit of material and quite a bit of good material. And finally, at the end, I'm going to recap everything that we covered so that you have a clear understanding of what it is, give you my contact information if you have any questions, and then also give you my website information in case you want to visit that. So let's move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about the 3 kinds of people that need this course. Now, you may not fall into any of these categories, and that doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't take anything away from this course. But this course has 3 specific audiences, and so I've geared this course toward those 3 specific audiences. The first one is, of course, people that have trouble coming up with ideas at all. I get people come to me all the time and they say, I'd love to be a writer, I'd love to write short stories, I'd love to write novels, I'd love to write blogs, I'd love to write poetry, whatever, but I just don't have any ideas. I can't come up with them. And this course is for people like that. The second group is, I get people come to me all the time and they say, I have ideas, I have lots of ideas, but I don't exactly know how to turn them into stories. I don't have a process in place to do that. And I know that's frustrating for them. And the third group is kind of a subset of the second group, which is people that have ideas and they can't process them, but they think they can. They've actually convinced themselves that they're going to write the story someday. And these are the procrastinators. I'm not judging anyone. I used to be like this too. But this course is for procrastinators to teach you a good process to take that good intention of writing a story and turn it into action, the action of actually writing a story. So let's go to the next slide, which is what this course is not. I don't want you to think that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the standard English rules, grammar, spelling, exceptions or exceptions to exceptions, rules, writing styles, word choices, or anything like that. That's not what this course is. I'm not saying that that's not important. I think you should consult books. I think you should consult people that know about these things, but this is not what this course covers. If you struggle with any kind of grammar, spelling, or standard English rules, what I would suggest is have someone read your story and edit it for you. You may even have to pay them a little bit, or you may find someone that'll do it for free. I even have people do that sometimes, just to get a second set of eyes on my stories. I don't always do it, but this course is not going to cover anything like that. So I would encourage you, if this is what you're looking for, to continue doing searches. There's a lot of good information out there about this. With that said, let's go on to the course goals, which is the next slide. And I have 2 goals in developing this course, 2 things that I'd like you to be able to take away from the course. The course is called How to Effortlessly Write the Perfect Short Story in an Hour, or hopefully less. And I want you to be able to develop a short story idea in less than 1 hour, which will take some practice, but in time you should be able to do it. And I also want you to be able to write a short story in less than 1 hour. And so I want to make sure that you distinguish between those 2 processes. You don't sit down and write a short story and let that be it. You actually have to plan the short story and then write the short story. So those two goals, keep those in mind as we move through this course material. And let's go right into the theory of writing and why it's important, which is the next slide. And to be perfectly honest, you can't write good fiction if you don't understand the theory behind short stories. There are rules to short stories like there are rules to anything else. And, you know, a lot of people say you should break the rules, and I agree with them. I agree with them. But there are some rules that you just shouldn't break because they bring order to a story. They give the reader what the reader expects. And we want the reader to be satisfied when he or she finishes reading your story and not disappointed. The rules can help with that. Also, I believe you can't really be a successful writer if you don't understand that theory either. There are very few people that make a lot of money writing anything if they don't understand the theory that goes into it, whether they're newspaper journalists or fiction writers or technical writers or anything else. So I want to make sure that you understand why we're going over some of this theory information when I know you're probably eager to get right into the meat of how to write the story. I want to make sure that we go over some very important things. And one important thing we're going to go over in the next slide is the concept of story ideas being appropriate or inappropriate. Now, you're probably going to think that I'm going to argue that a story idea should be appropriate, but that's not the case. A story idea should not be too appropriate. And a story idea should not be too inappropriate either. And when you talk about a really awesome short story, it balances between appropriate and inappropriate. And going to the next slide, I'm going to give you some examples of why that is. I want to make sure we go very slowly through this and hit this home. So think about this question. I'm going to read it to you. Is it appropriate for a motorist to stop at a stop sign and look to see if there is traffic coming? Now you may be scratching your head and say, why would you ask such a question? It's obvious. Of course it's appropriate. There's no question about it. And you might think that the question is even ridiculous to ask because no reasonable person would think it was inappropriate to do this. Hold that thought. And let's go to the next slide. And consider this question. If another customer cuts in front of you in line at Starbucks, is it appropriate to kill him? And of course, I'm sure you're probably chuckling at that question right now, thinking, well, of course it's not appropriate to kill someone just because they cut in front of you at Starbucks. Yes, that's an obnoxious thing to do, but no reasonable person would kill them. So these two questions, very different answers. One's yes, one's no, one's appropriate, one's inappropriate. They don't have a lot in common, but they do have one very important thing in common, and that is most people agree on them. There's not a lot of debate about whether or not these things are appropriate or inappropriate, and that's important, and I'm going to tell you why. Moving to the next slide, I'm going to ask you another question. Well, actually, and moving to the next slide, I'm going to tell you that we know the answer to these questions and we don't debate them because it's ridiculous to even talk about them, so that's what the next slide is. But if we go to the next slide, we're actually going to ask a question that's of a slightly different nature, and I want you to bear with me because it's a very potent and hot topic. But just bear with me because I'm not trying to get into this topic, I'm just trying to make a point, which will happen very shortly. Is it appropriate for a woman to have an abortion as a means of birth control? Now, when we talk about this question, the world is really divided on this, and nobody really agrees on it. Some people say yes, some say no. If I asked 1 million people, there'd probably be a division, and it might be 50-50, or it might be 60-40, or it might be 70-30. I actually don't know what the public opinion is on this at this point, except that it's constantly changing, and it's constantly being debated. And so here we have a gray area. We have a topic that kind of resides in the gray area of appropriate and inappropriate. It's something that people don't agree on, something that they hotly debate. And that actually makes, not necessarily this subject, but subjects like it, subjects that are hotly debated, are actually very good short story ideas because people talk about them. And when a writer is successful, it tends to be because people talk about the things that they're writing. If we go to the next slide, I just want to emphasize that you want to push the reader a little bit. You want to hit their hot buttons, but you don't want to push them too far. So you want to make sure that you're staying in that gray area of appropriate and inappropriate. You want to provoke them a little bit, but not so much that they won't take you seriously. But you also don't want to be too appropriate because readers are going to find you boring. And so you may feel like this particular part of the presentation is unnecessary. It's actually quite necessary. When you're thinking about story ideas, you may actually want to reject some of the ones that you've come up with if they fall into either of these two extremes. So I want you to think of that very carefully. Going to the next slide, I want to talk about some successful writers. For those of you that are familiar with the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins or Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, these authors are very famous. They've written some very popular literature, and they've written literature that has been hotly debated. The Hunger Games, of course, is about a bunch of kids that get together and fight to the death. Harry Potter is about a wizard, a young wizard. And these are issues that people don't necessarily agree on. Some people believe that magic is okay. Some people think you shouldn't talk about it. Most people don't think that children should kill each other, but we recognize something of ourselves in that. We know that we've been cruel to each other in the past, and so both of these concepts, while very different, kind of linger around the appropriate, inappropriate gray area. And they spark debate. People took them seriously, and that's what contributed to their success. So, and just summing up appropriate versus inappropriate, keep in mind that when you have short story ideas, you want to push your readers a little bit, but you don't want to push them too far. You want to strike that balance. Now I'm going to go to the next slide, and we're going to change gears a little bit. And this is more of a rant than anything else, but I think it's very important for you to understand what I feel the role of inspiration is. A lot of my colleagues will argue that inspiration is very important, and I would argue that it's not. So I'll ask you another question that you'll probably feel is ridiculous. Do you think your writing is better when you're high on a drug or if you're intoxicated with alcohol? Would you think that sober people write better than inebriated people? And the answer you'd probably come up with is mood-altering drugs, mind-altering drugs are probably not a good idea for writing, and neither is inspiration. Inspiration is one of those things that changes our state of consciousness and actually impedes our writing ability. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to be talking about problems with inspiration. A lot of people rely on it, but it's unreliable. You never know when it's going to come to you. You may wake up in the middle of the night and say, I've got a great idea for a short story, and a lot of times it's not a great idea for a short story. You're just really excited about it, and no one else would be. If you rely on inspiration, you'll probably find that it just doesn't happen enough. If you want to write a lot, you're going to have to do it sometimes when you're not inspired. And in my personal opinion, you should never write when you're inspired. It actually hurts your writing. So we're going to go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about how to overcome problems with inspiration. You certainly don't need inspiration to write. And I hit this home because most of the time you're not inspired. Most of the time you just feel normally. But you still have to write if you want to be a successful writer, because successful writers write a lot. You can generally pretty easily write short stories and get ideas without any kind of inspiration. And I would take this even a step further than probably my colleagues would, and say that if you are inspired to write, it's better if you wait till that inspiration passes before you write, just like you would wait until you were sober to drive. It's that important. Inspiration is a killer to writing. You need to write when you're not in this manic mode. You need to write when you're actually thinking clearly. Inspiration is a form of mania, and you need to wait until you're thinking clearly. So that's all I'm going to say about inspiration. Obviously, I can't tell you what to do, but this is my recommendation. Keep your ideas on the gray area of appropriate and inappropriate, and keep your mind level and clear away from inspiration. Moving to the next slide, I'm going to talk about the 3 essential aspects of a short story. And these are just things that, these are going to come up a lot during our presentation, and I wanted to go over them now. Whenever you're writing or reading a short story, you can start noticing these things. One is that a character in a short story, whenever that character takes any action or does anything, they always have a reason for doing it. And that might seem obvious, but a lot of writers don't realize that. If a woman decides to get a divorce from her husband after 20 years, there has to be a reason for that. She can't just wake up one day and say, I want a divorce. There has to be a reason, and it's your job as a writer to show what that is. The second thing is, you need to set up whatever happens in a short story. Nothing ever just happens. So if there's a storm, you might want to mention that someone saw it in the weather. If your main character wins a tennis match, you might want to make sure that your readers know that she played tennis. Things like that are very important, and a lot of amateur writers don't keep up with that. These are extreme examples, but you always need to keep in mind that whenever something happens, that event or that action needs to be set up by something. We'll talk a lot more about that as we go further into the presentation. The third aspect of a short story that's very important, and I think most good short stories have this in common, is that the main character in the short story goes through some major change because of what happens in the short story. It might be a change in behavior. It might be a change in personality. It might be a change in opinion. But there's some sort of change, something that happens to the main character as a result of the short story, and that's actually what we consider the point of the short story. Something happens to the main character, and the main character changes. So those are the three aspects of a short story. And with that said, we're going to get into ideas, and this is where we're going to spend a lot of our time. We're going to talk about what exactly is an idea. Now, the first bullet point on this screen that I just changed to is that an idea is not a simple concept. And that's a little bit misleading because there are actually ideas that are very simple concepts. In fact, most ideas start out as simple concepts. As we move through the idea process that I'm going to go over in a few minutes, you'll find that ideas become much less simple as they move through that process, but a finished idea is certainly not a simple concept. A finished idea is actually a highly developed blueprint for writing a short story. Just like an architect would not build a building without a blueprint, an author should not write a short story without having fully developed an idea and planned out the short story. An idea covers all the bases in a short story, answers all the unanswered questions, and even has the ending of the story. A lot of writers believe that they're not supposed to know the ending of the story until they start writing it. That's not the case. You need to know the ending of your story, exactly how it's going to end, before you ever start writing. And finally, I'm going to tell you that idea has a lifespan just like a human being, and we're going to go to the next slide. I'm going to go over that lifespan with you. The 4 stages of the idea process are just like 4 stages in the human life cycle. An idea starts out in its infancy stage, moves through to childhood. After that, it goes into adolescence, and then it moves into adulthood. So we can quickly go to the next slide and start talking about each stage of these, for these ideas. Stage 1 is infancy. And an idea in its infancy is pretty much the most basic concept of a story. It can involve a person, or it can involve an event. And sometimes it involves both a person and an event, but not very often. So I can give you some very simple examples of some very simple ideas in their infancy. You might say, well, I would like to write a story about a US senator. I'd like to write a story about some event that happened, the 9/11 attacks or whatever. I run into a lot of people who are at this stage in their idea process. For example, a lot of people I meet might have gone through a very stressful, traumatic, or emotional event. They might have gotten a divorce, or they might have had a family member that had cancer, some very terrible event like that. And what I find is that when they say, I'd like to write a story about a woman getting a divorce, or I'd like to write a story about a man who got cancer, that's an idea in its infancy. There's nothing wrong with those ideas. The fact is they need to be developed through the entire idea process and not just left in their infancy. If left in their infancy, the short story will probably never materialize. If we move on to the next slide, I'm going to tell you how to move an idea out of infancy and into its childhood, and you do this by introducing a problem. And you might say, well, if a woman is getting a divorce or a man has cancer, that is the problem. Well, it could be, but we might want to introduce something more than that. So let's explore the childhood aspect of ideas, and we'll go to the next slide to do that. An idea in its childhood is just like when it's in its infancy, except we've already added a problem. So I already said that, and the question you always ask is, what's wrong? What exactly is wrong? Now, you don't have to solve the problem at this point. You don't even have to want to solve the problem at this point, and the main character doesn't even necessarily have to need to solve the problem at this point. The main character may be perfectly happy with this problem. But at stage 2 in the idea process, we've simply taken an idea in its infancy and added a problem, and that's how it works. Now, if we move to the next slide, I can give you an example of an idea in its childhood. We said in the idea in its infancy that a U.S. senator could be, we could say, well, I'm going to write a story about a U.S. senator, and that could be an idea in its infancy. But if we add a problem and say, well, this U.S. senator has a drug addiction that he's trying to hide, that's a simple example of an idea in stage 2, an idea in its childhood. And like I said, an idea in its childhood, it usually involves a problem that the main character is not particularly motivated to solve. At this particular time in the idea process, the U.S. senator that has the drug addiction is not necessarily trying to stop using drugs. He may not even view it as a problem. And that leads us to, how exactly do we move an idea out of the childhood stage and into the adolescent stage? And the way you do that is you introduce a reason to take action on the problem. So let's go to the next slide, and you can see in the first bullet that idea in its adolescence is basically an idea in its infancy with a problem, and in addition to the person or event and the problem, there's a reason to take action on that problem. The question becomes, why does the main character care about the problem? What exactly happened that the main character all of a sudden cared about the problem? We go on to the next slide and we see an example of an idea in its adolescence. We're going to use the U.S. Senator example. We're going to say the U.S. Senator has a drug problem. He's been hiding it for years, but all of a sudden he gets caught by one of his colleagues, and his colleague decides to blackmail him. Now the U.S. Senator sees his problem, and he has motivation to try to stop it, or solve it, take action on it, or do something with it. We go to the next slide, and we're still in stage 3. But our problem now is that we have to move the idea from adolescence into adulthood. And in order to do that, you have to introduce 2 factors. First, we have to decide what action the main character is going to take based on his reason for addressing the problem. So we see that the U.S. Senator has been confronted on his drug addiction and is being blackmailed. We have to decide what exactly is this senator going to do about it. The second thing you have to do to move an idea from its adolescent stage into adulthood is you have to fill in any gaps and answer any unanswered questions. And this involves what we talked about earlier, which is setting up the events of the story. In this case, you may have to think backwards a little bit, and we'll get into that further as I show you how I went through this very process with a short story that I wrote myself. But for now, we're going to go to the next slide, and we're going to say, of course, we define an idea in its adulthood as a person or event with a problem and a reason to confront it, and it also has the action that the main character is going to take to try to deal with the problem in some way. Sometimes that action is nothing at all. Sometimes that action is a change in thought processes or a change in opinion. But there has to be something that happens. And like we said, it also answers the questions that we don't have the answers to yet. It fills in the gaps. We might have to go back, for example, and set up, well, one question you might have, for example, is if the U.S. Senator has been using drugs for years, why is he just now being caught? Well, it's your job as the author to answer that question, and you may have to answer that before the senator actually gets caught. Maybe he got locked out of the bathroom one day and just couldn't wait to snort his cocaine or whatever, and so he sneaked into the closet, and then another senator walked in. I'm just kind of making that up on the fly. But this is going to be your responsibility to answer that question so that your readers aren't lost. Going to the next slide, I've got you a simple example of an idea in its adulthood. We said the U.S. Senator has a drug problem. He's being blackmailed by a colleague. So the action the senator can take, just as being theoretical here, and this is not a story I've written, by the way, and it's not one I plan to write. This is just for this training session. But I must say the senator decides to hire an assassin to kill his colleague, I guess to prevent him from being blackmailed. Then we're going to say the assassin gets caught and turns in the senator. And as an interesting twist of irony, which I think is very important in short stories and works of fiction of any kind, is that the senator then goes to jail and has a job training dogs to detect drug sense. I've heard that in prisons, sometimes the prisoners train dogs to do various things. I don't know if they train them to detect drug sense, but it's possible. But for the sake of this training, this is what I'm saying, just to show you kind of how an ironic ending could occur. We move to the next slide and say, this is a very simple example. It should be more complex than this. And as you get more experience with writing, you'll find that it will be more complex than this. But I'm actually going to go through a real exercise together with you to demonstrate how to move through this process, and we're going to do that right now. And as we do that right now, we're going to go to the next slide, which talks about a real example of the idea process. So I want to set this up for you. First, I want to say that when I decided to write the story, I was not inspired to write it. I just decided that I needed to write a story. And so I said, it's time to write a story, and I'm going to write one. And I didn't know what it was going to be about. I had no idea what it was going to be about when I sat down to write the story. And that's kind of part of the purpose of this training, is to teach you how to do just that. To write fiction when you don't have an idea and when you're not inspired to be able to come up with an idea and develop it fully. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to take this real example, and it's going to be idea stage 1, infancy. And just randomly, I pretty much decided that I was going to write about a man who was visiting a therapist. And so I don't know why I thought of that, or what I was thinking of, or what had gone through my head, but that's what I decided to write about. So I knew who the main character was, and so I had an idea in stage 1. Moving to the next slide, when I went to stage 2, I had to give the man a problem, because that's my job as an author, is to give him a problem, assign him that problem, not even something that he necessarily has to deal with immediately, but just assign him a problem. So I said, he didn't know why he was there, and he was nervous about another man who was also in the waiting room with him, and the man with him was insane. If I move to the next slide, I'll show you that I added another problem. The main character was actually dealing with the death of his family, and that was hard for him, but I want to point out that the man wasn't necessarily taking any action on that, because for our purposes in the story, he'd not yet been provoked. Nothing had happened to provoke him. So there was no interest, there was no action to be taken, and that's why we're still in stage 2 of the idea. When we go to the next slide and we're in stage 3, my job as the author was to provoke the character to action. And so what I did was I had the characters strike up a conversation. And in the midst of that conversation, my main character, what we call our protagonist, my main character, was offended by the other man because the other man had murdered his own family the way my main character's family had been murdered. So you see, as I was working through this idea process, I was trying to come up with all this stuff to add to it, and that's part of how I moved through stage 3. When we go to the next slide, we're still on stage 3, and I want to tell you that once this other man in the waiting room talked about this issue that he killed his family in the same way that the main character's family was killed, my main character was provoked. He was provoked to action. He hasn't taken action yet. We're not even necessarily sure what that's going to be. But he was provoked to action. So that's why we're in stage 3. So I wanted to move to stage 4. And when I moved to stage 4, which is the adulthood of the idea, I decided that a change in thought was going to be the main character's action. So the main character started thinking about his family and how hard they'd been to deal with, and kind of feeling remorse for a bad relationship with them. And the fact that this other man had talked about killing his own family caused this main character to think about his relationship with his family. We move to the next slide, and we find that at the end of the story, this main character finally realizes that he was the murderer. And he was actually, to give you a little information that's not in the slides, he was actually at this therapist's office by order of the court, although I didn't say that, it becomes clear at the end of the story, to get a psychiatric evaluation. He had actually blocked the murder out of his mind, and didn't realize he had done it, but once he started putting the pieces together that his family had been so mean to him, he realized he had done it. This revelation was an added irony in the story, and irony is a good writing technique. I know I've said that before, and I didn't actually make that a direct part of this presentation, but I want to hit that home. Whenever you can write with some irony, it's good to do that. Now let's go to the next slide, and the name of the story that I wrote is called The Moment I First Realized. If you go to my website, which is thefictionsite.com, you can actually read that story. You just click on stories and you can find The Moment I First Realized, and you can read the story that I just described to you based on the process that I just described to you, a real process that I went through. And you may read it and you may like it, you may hate it, you may say, well, this isn't a perfect story, you may have all kinds of opinions about it, but my point is I wanted to show you how I went through this very same idea process as a proven technique to come up with a short story pretty quickly without having any idea what it's going to be about when you sit down to write it. So that's the important thing that I want you to, one of the things that I want you to pull away from this training session. When we go to the next slide, I want you to think about this. Think about idea generation. Realize you don't have to have an idea when you sit down at the table, but when you actually do sit down, you're probably going to have written or maybe typed in a word processor several pages. Once you go through this idea process, you're working backwards, you're putting things in that you've left out accidentally, you're crafting the story even before it's written. I just want to emphasize more time that it's very important as a major part of the idea development process to always plan the end of your story even before you sit down to write the actual story. So I want to make sure you understand, you haven't written the story. The story is not written. You've just developed the idea. You've planned the whole story out. It's a very common myth that writers don't plan their stories' endings in advance, but that is not the case. They almost always do. I've heard of some even very famous writers that say they don't. I'm not sure if that's true or not, and you never know when people are telling an accurate version of what's going on, or if they're even aware of it, but my understanding is that authors generally plan the endings of their stories. I've even heard rumors that J.K. Rowling, when she started the Harry Potter series, consisting of 7 books, that she kind of had some idea of how all 7 of them were going to go before she started writing the first one. And I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I've heard that as a rumor, and I think it's a very I think it's a very plausible possibility. When we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about how to actually write the story. Now, you've taken your notes. You're going to constantly consult your notes. And as you consult your notes, I want you to keep in mind that there are 5 very important elements to a short story, almost without exception. As you start developing and growing as a writer, or as you continue growing as a writer, you can start playing with these elements. You may find that they mesh with each other a little more. They're not so clearly divided. But for now, we'll talk about 5 theoretical elements of a story, which you can use for practical use in actually writing the story. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the elements of a story. It's actually a very good habit to include all this information. And you see the 5 habits on this slide. You've got the introduction, the initial development, what I call the provocation, the action, and the resolution. So these are the 5 elements in a short story when you actually sit down to write it. I'm going to go over each of these so that you'll know exactly what to do when it comes to, after you finish going through the idea process, when it comes time actually for you to write the story. So let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk about the first elements of a short story, which are the introduction. Of course, you're going to start with the introduction, and the introduction should introduce the main character. And a lot of times you can give physical attributes of the main character. A reader will generally be interested in what the main character looks like. I don't think I actually even did that in the story that I described for you above. I can't remember, but it's a good practice if you can tell what the physical characteristics of the person are. That can be helpful. When we go to the next slide, we'll give you some suggestions on a powerful introduction. I would never just sit down and say, there was once a man sitting in a therapist's office. I'm going to find some other way to do that. I'm going to talk about the main character sitting in a chair, maybe describe the office a little bit, how he wants to have a cigarette, how the woman, he's waiting for the woman to call him back, he's worried about what he's going to talk to the guy about. And as I start describing all this, the reader will figure out that he's in a therapist's office, and so I don't actually have to say it. You want to remember that the reader gets a lot of satisfaction out of figuring some of this stuff out on his own. So I want to point that out to you, that you want to trust your reader. It's like a writer that I really respect a lot told me one time, always trust the reader. Don't assume that the reader is stupid. And so you want to make sure that you're giving the reader that experience of being able to figure some things out on his own, or his or her own. When we go into the next slide, we're going to talk about the initial development. And there are 2 goals in the initial development, and one of them is to describe the problem. You remember that when we were in the childhood aspect of the idea, we had to assign a problem to the main character. The initial development element of the story is where we actually start to describe that problem. And it's also in the initial development that we set up the future events in the story, which is actually something we did in the what we call the adulthood stage of the idea process, where we started filling in the gaps and saying, well, since this event occurred, I need to make sure that such and such occurs beforehand, and so we go back and scribble things in the margin and say, don't forget to add this, or something like that. You want to make sure that all of that goes in the initial development. Moving to the next slide, continuing with initial development, I'll tell you how I kind of went about it in the story that I wrote. I made sure that the reader was aware of the pain the main character felt at the loss of his family, and how annoyed he was that his family mistreated him, because this actually helped it make sense at the end that he killed them. So you see how I was setting things up in advance. So the reader would say, aha, that makes sense, but he wouldn't say, what the hell was that? Because we don't want him to say, what the hell was that? We want to say, aha, that makes sense, I'm surprised, and I'm delighted by by the surprise, but not what the hell. And finally, I wanted to convey a sense of nervousness and confusion in the main character. So that was something that I really wanted to do. So in this case, the main character has a problem. In moving to the next slide, we find that there's a provocation. The provocation is basically what causes the main character to take action on his problem. You remember in the adolescence stage of the idea process, we decided that the main character needed a reason to take action on his problem. And in the adulthood stage, he actually took that action. But this is the adolescent stage of the idea process as we see it in the elements of a short story, the provocation. So I had to give the main character a reason to act, or at least think differently about his situation, and the way I did that, like I said earlier, was the main character and this man in the waiting room with him had a conversation. And the main character was upset by that conversation. That conversation caused the main character to think differently and react differently and look at things differently. And once you see that conversation in the story, you can start to see the main character change a little bit. In the next slide, we continue with the provocation. And I just want to tell you that, again, the purpose of the provocation section is to give the main character a reason to deal with this problem or take some action on it. Without that element, there's no point to the story. Things would just continue as they would, and there would be no point in even writing a story. So we always want to have some sort of provocation. Provocation is the reason the main character develops, the reason he or she takes action. And it's very important to have something that provokes the main character to action, which is one of our aspects of a short story. Characters never do anything without a reason. Remember that. So we want to make sure that there's provocation. We move to the next slide, we go to the action element of a short story. It's the fourth element in the short story. And as I say in the first bullet, the action is just that. The main character decides to do something. Even if the main character decides to do nothing, that's something. In this case, you've not read the story, obviously, but the main character yelled at the man who was with him and actually started thinking about his life differently. We see a real change in the main character as we read the provocation the provocation section, certainly, and the action section of the story. So we see what's going on. We see what he does. We don't necessarily know what the consequences of that are, or what the result is, or even how he changes, because that comes later. Right now, we just know that he's taking some action, and that action is to yell at the man and then sit down and think about what's going on a little bit more. When we go to the next slide, we talk about the resolution of the short story. The resolution shows the results of what the main character did. It shows what happened based on the action. In the case of the story that I mentioned above, the main character finally realized, it finally clicked in his mind, that he was the one that killed his family. He was the one that did it. And it took all these events in the short story to bring him to that conclusion. And we see that he changed. He changed because he didn't realize who he was. All of a sudden, after the events of the short story, he realized who he was. And that's another of the three aspects of the short story we talked about earlier. The main character has to change, and that is what occurred in this story. Now, in going to the next slide, we're going to talk about the importance of these elements. Obviously, you should never ignore any of them, but there is one specific element that frequently gets ignored by amateur writers, and that's the initial development. And just to remind you, the initial development is where we describe the problem in detail and set up future events of the story. A lot of times, novice writers will ignore that particular section of the story. So make sure that you always set things up, that you describe the problem in detail, and that you don't ignore the initial development section as an element of the short story. And again, just to give you some way to see kind of how this is put into action. you can go to thefictionsite.com and read that story. It's called The Moment I First Realized, and you can see how this came about, how this came together. Now let's do a recap. We're coming toward the end of our training session. I want to just let you know that you can write a short story. You can do it quickly. I know a lot of writers that spend a lot of time writing short stories, and that's not necessary. You can actually churn them out pretty quickly. Successful writers do that. Successful writers write a lot, and I want to make sure that you're aware that that's how you have to work if you're going to be a successful writer. It's entirely possible to complete a rough draft of your story in an hour. There may be some exceptions to that if you don't type very well. I know not everyone types very well. Also, if you choose to write an exceptionally long short story, maybe a 10,000 word short story, which I would consider long, it may take you a little longer than an hour to write it. But if you go through this process of developing an idea, the manuscript largely writes itself. You take these 5 elements, you go through each of them, and at the end you can spend some time revising, editing, whatever you need to do to polish the short story. But there's no reason, there's no frequent reason you shouldn't be able to write the manuscript of a short story in an hour. There's not much reason that you shouldn't be able to plan a short story going through the idea process in an hour. Let's recap on the goals. We talked about the 3 types of people that the course is for. Of course, I hope it was helpful. Don't forget, the course's main goals are to develop a short story to its completion in an hour, and to write a short story in an hour. Going to the next slide, we talked about appropriateness and inspiration. I won't get into that too much. Obviously, you want to make sure your story is slightly provocative, but not too much. You know you shouldn't rely on inspiration. I hit that home quite well. I hope you understand that very clearly. Inspiration actually harms you more than helps you. It's a common misconception. Don't let that happen to you. If you are inspired to write, if you feel this whimsical lust for writing, wait till that passes before you continue. Also, going to the next slide, we talk about the 3 short story aspects. I put a very abbreviated version of those here. Characters need a reason to do everything that they do. You want to set everything up before it happens. We talked about this a lot even after I finished talking about the aspects of the short story. They came up quite a bit, as you see, so they're important. And also, the main character should change quite profoundly because of the events of the story, whether it's opinion, a behavior, something like that. There needs to be an obvious change. Going to a recap on the next slide about ideas. Anything can be an initial idea for a short story. You want to start with a person or an event and work from that. I went through the idea process. I won't do that again, but it's very, very important that you develop the short story idea prior to moving forward to actually writing the story. And if you don't get anything else out of this training session, I hope you get that. And on to the next slide. I want to just emphasize that when you're working with an idea, put it through the entire process of idea development. You want to make sure your idea is fully developed. When you're writing your story, obviously you want to consult your notes, anything you've written in the margins, anything you need to satisfy all the requirements of the 5 elements, especially the initial development. You want to make sure you don't forget that, or you don't underestimate the importance of that. Just to give you a quick recap on the 5 elements of a short story, because this can be confusing. I know a lot of people probably would memorize it on the first time. You start with the introduction, where you put in the main character and you leave some things to the reader's imagination. The initial development is where you describe the problem, and of course set any future events that you need to do, that you need to set up. Provocation is where the main character has a reason to do something about the problem, even if it's nothing. The action is what the main character does about that problem. The resolution is how the character changes and what the consequences of that action were. And when we move further into the conclusion, which is actually the wrap-up of this training presentation, which I'm very glad you got through, and I hope you got something great out of, I just want to say, follow this process to write short stories. You can do it often. You don't need inspiration. It's very easy to write short stories once you put some practice into it. Obviously, you will improve with practice. You need to put some time into it, especially if you're a new writer. If you're an advanced writer, a lot of this information will come naturally to you now that you've heard it. If you're a new writer, don't give up. And just to let you know, when you start sending your short stories off, they're going to be rejected right and left. And it's not because you're a bad writer. It's because people reject short stories right and left. Don't let that stop you. Just keep trying. You will get published eventually if you keep trying. Of course, you can visit my website, thefictionsite.com. Read my work. I'd be honored if you want to send love mail, hate mail, criticism, compliments. Please no death threats. But if you want to read thefictionsite.com, you're welcome to do so. I'd be happy for you to do that. You're always welcome to write me at andy@thefictionsite.com. I'll get your email. I will respond as soon as I can. At this point, I'm able to respond to all my emails, so I'm not like world famous yet. But I'd be delighted to hear from you. I'll be happy to respond. That concludes this training session. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or visit my website. And other than that, I hope you got something great out of this training presentation. Andy Heath signing off. Have a very nice day.